We have Robin Wright, who between many other things is a journalist at the New Yorker. And we have David Sanger, who between many other things as well, is a journalist at the New York Times. Overall, wonderful, brilliant political analysts, and that are gonna discuss today the challenges that President Biden is going to face in his government. Thank you for being with us, and the microphone is all yours. Thank you, Enrique, for organizing.
Thank you, and thanks very much to Robin and David for joining us. We know that it's a very busy time in Washington. You've been writing extensively, and we thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. First, a piece of news. We are very happy in Mexico that the Trump era has ended. Probably you can hear the clamor and the cheers over the border, but that's a reality. I mean, probably since the 19th century, we had not had such a hostile president of the United States towards Mexico as the recent one. So we're very happy that he left. And I want just to say special thanks to Jonathan Price, our friend from Aspen, USA, for helping us organizing this webinar. Okay, I'll kick it off with Robin. You wrote a magnificent piece a couple of days ago at the New Yorker on the challenges for Biden's foreign policy. You have seen that the chessboard internationally has been moving quite a bit, while the United States was very much into an isolationist policy. What is your take on what the Biden administration can do, bearing in mind that domestic pressures are perhaps at the forefront, and that I noticed that during the inaugural speech, he only mentioned one paragraph on the world, which is unheard of. What is your take? I mean, what is the room for maneuver of the Biden administration at the world stage?
Thank you very much, Enrique. I'm delighted to be with you today, and I'm particularly honored to be with David Sanger, a longtime colleague for whom I have enormous respect. I think that to start our discussion, it might be useful to kind of look at the 7 pillars of Biden's foreign policy, which frame his approach to almost everything. This is a man who has arguably more foreign policy experience than any, at least recent, and perhaps more than any American, given the fact he spent 36 years in the Senate, 9 years in the vice presidency, and he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which led him to travel around the world. He knows personally more than 150 foreign leaders. So he starts off with a running game. And I think if you look at the 7 pillars, the first is very basic. The West is back. And Biden is a pragmatic realist. He wants to breathe life into the kind of transatlantic relationship, the neighbors. He wants the traditional American allies and alliances to be strengthened. You'll not hear any language about America first. Secondly, I think he wants to pool resources when it comes to common threats, and I don't think that means building a wall. He wants to, revive and strengthen NATO. I think when it comes to kind of common challenges, particularly an assertive Russia or an aggressive China, he wants allies and partners to work together, and he will work more closely with them. Third, I think he wants to restore the international accords that have framed the 21st century, be it climate change or the Iran nuclear accord or New START. And then fourth, I think on human rights, this is a man who's going to reinsert that as a pillar, a platform of US foreign policy very high up. His director of national intelligence in her confirmation hearing said she was going to release the report on the Saudi murder of Jamal Khashoggi. This is something the Trump administration, because of its close alliance with the monarchy in Saudi Arabia, had refused to release. The new administration has spoken out about what Russia has done in the apprehension of Navalny, its leading opponent, Putin's leading opponent. I think fifth, it'll be very tough on dictators and on undemocratic regime. there will be no glad handling of Kim Jong-un and Recep Erdogan and Rodriguez Duterte and El-Sisi, the former field marshal, now president of Egypt. I'm actually very interested in hearing what David thinks will happen between Biden and Kim Jong-un and whether there'll be what happens after the bromance is over. Six, I think that Biden will be much more respectful and helpful to countries that have fewer resources and less power. There will be no language, condescending language, like he used about African countries, a word I wouldn't want to repeat. And finally, I think that in all of his policies, Biden is going to be an unapologetic globalist. He really, even though he is 78, the oldest of all of our presidents, I think he understands at least the beginnings of globalization and how the world has to adapt. Does he have the answers? Probably not. Some of his staff may. One of the great problems in the United States is a bureaucratic, plotting democracy has not been very good at adapting to rapid global changes. And I think he wants to try to do that. And we see that reflected in the pace of activities, at least on domestic policy, in his first 24 hours.
Yeah, actually, he was quite active yesterday, signing 17 executive orders. Some of them have a very special ring to Mexico because have to do with DACA, Dreamers, migration, and so on. But let me turn just for a second to domestic politics in the US. Do you foresee the creation of a new party? I mean, is Trumpism strong enough so as to create a new party in case the Republicans would not like to follow his footsteps?
David,
well, first, thanks very much for having me here. It's great to be here, and particularly great to be here with my friend Robin, who we've done a lot together over the years. And her piece in the New Yorker the other day, for those who haven't seen it, is really a great description of where Biden is. A few things that I would say on the domestic side, and then I just wanted to go fill in on a couple of places. I agree with everything that Robin said, but a few things I wanted to add. So Trump has left the Republican Party in a pretty terrible place, right? Because
Yes.
you've got three elements of the party right now. You've got a group of the never Trumpers who never signed on to Trump, who have supported the impeachment effort, who you might even say were somewhat responsible for triggering the early days of the January 6th crisis up on the Hill, because it was a group of never Trumpers who put out the ad. This was the Lincoln group that was taking out these television ads that they knew Trump would see by putting them on Fox in DC, that raised the point Mike Pence is going to have to choose between the Constitution, the party, and Donald Trump, figuring that Donald Trump had no idea that on January 6th, the electors would have to be selected. And indeed, that's what triggered him. And that led him to call everybody to come show up on January 6th in Washington, and you know the rest of the story. That's one segment. The second segment are a group of people like Mitch McConnell now, who were delighted to see Trump go, think they have to rid him of it, would even blame him for the January 6th events, but aren't quite sure whether they're ready to go vote for impeachment and banning him from the party. And then you've got a third element within the Republican Party, who are the people who believe in Trump. There are, probably 35, 40 million people out of that group who still defend him completely. Think about the fact that 138 members of the House of Representatives voted to block the acceptance of the electoral votes from Pennsylvania, even after the riot. Okay, so that would be the group, presumably, that would break off into this third party you referred to. And that didn't work out terribly well for Teddy Roosevelt when he tried it. You were about to ask something there.
Right. In your piece, David, yesterday, you mentioned that it's been 150 years since the last transition of power was not attended by the incumbent. What does it mean, the fact that Mr. Trump did not attend yesterday's ceremony?
It said more about Trump than anything else. I mean, in the end, he had to kind of accept the election result. I mean, he went off and gave a brief farewell comments at Andrews Air Force Base, in which he said, well, the next administration, they'll have good luck because we've left them with the country in such great shape. But that was an acknowledgement, by leaving that there was a new government coming in. But yes, the last president who refused to attend was Andrew Johnson in 1869, before Grant came in. Woodrow Wilson did not attend, but it wasn't a matter of refusal. He was too sick, and he sort of rode his successor up to the Capitol, and then basically bailed out of the ceremony. But that wasn't a stand he was taking. So Trump could go off and try to create a third party. It probably would be the biggest single favor he could do to the Democrats if he did that, because the Democrats are at high risk given how narrow their margins were, right, in the Congress, of losing Congress in 2 years and maybe the presidency in 4. Who knows? Who knows who would come up there? But if Trump actually split the party, then I think that would probably be the biggest gift he could give to the Democrats. I'd be interested to hear Robin on that. A few thoughts just on the foreign policy side. One of the remarkable things you've seen today is that the Trump folks landed with full staff. I'm not just talking about at the secretary and deputy secretary level, but you look at the Pentagon. They swore in 20 or 30 people yesterday. Same is true at a number of the other places. The National Security Council, very fully staffed right now. I would guess that they are staffed today at levels that it probably took Trump 5 or 6 months even to get to, because Biden knew exactly who he wanted and exactly, as Robin pointed out, what he wanted. And for Trump, this was all new. I mean, take a look at Trump's interviews that Maggie Haberman and I did with him in 2016 on foreign policy. And he was turning and asking us what we thought about various things, because he had not even given them a brief thought at the moment. The second thing that I think is important to know is that what he signed yesterday, as you pointed out, DACA, ending the building of the wall, so forth. Some of these were somewhat symbolic, but at least they pointed a new direction. I think one area that you would all want to go take a close look at, that I think will differ from the Obama years, is Russia and China, the superpower relationships. This is not an administration in a mood to go do a reset with Russia, given what's happened. And on China, as you could tell from Tony Blinken's confirmation hearing the other day, basically the old Democratic consensus and Obama era consensus that China would, over time, as we brought them into Western economic and governing institutions, would moderate its behavior, was totally and completely wrong. And he has put in place a series of hardliners who believe essentially that China is headed off to be a significant, persistent competitor with the United States for influence, that it's not containable, but that we may well be able to wall them off to some degree. On North Korea, Robin, I suspect you're going to see the North Koreans, greet the new president. Many leaders sent, postcards, greetings, telephone calls. The North Koreans are going to shoot a missile, right? In fact, we already see satellite photographs of them getting ready to go off to do it. It's what they've done in past times. And I think the Iran relationship, which Robin knows better than anybody, is going to be a very slow walk to put the agreement back together. And Tony almost said as much in his confirmation hearing. I don't think you're going to see a rush back to the JCPOA, the Iran agreement from 2015, in part because I think the Iranians themselves will throw new conditions in the way.
Uh, Again, going back for a second to domestic politics, if I may. Um, Yesterday's speech was had one single word, was unity, basically, right? Do you see that the medicine, Robin, was enough to heal the wounds that have been inflicted in the past 4 years? That is, that glue is strong enough so as to get together Americans again, or something else will be needed?
It was a wonderfully inspiring day, and I think we all came away believing that America may be a little bit better today than it was yesterday or the day before. But the idea of unity in the United States, I think, is illusory. I think that we have a lot of identity issues, and I suspect David would agree that we've covered enough wars and civil wars where people will say, whether it's, yes, we're all Syrians, or yes, we're all Iraqis, or yes, we're all Yugoslavs, or yes, we're all Soviets. But when you ask them what that means, they have very different definitions. And that's the problem in the United States today. We think of ourselves as Americans, but boy, the idea of everyone embracing equally the same values just doesn't exist. I wrote a piece after Charlottesville 3 years ago talking to some of America's greatest Civil War historians, and how all of them believe that America was at a precipice, that we are, as we've seen play out in the last 2 weeks, that there are such fundamental divisions that the chance of a new civil war, not one like we fought 150, 60 years ago, but one that is more corrosive, that we become that the fabric of America frays, and you see whether it's red or blue, the idea of creating a purple America, whatever all the women who attended the inauguration celebrations, whatever they wore in their purples, the fact is that's just not where we are right now. And I think Joe Biden, whatever outreach he makes to Republicans, will not be sufficient in a first term, and who knows whether he will run for a second, to get us to a place where we embrace each other, or at least tolerate each other. The divisions are so deep, and it's not just Trump, it goes back much further. This is something that happened during Bush, happened during Obama, just in different ways, and it kind of exploded or became more visible under President Trump. We're a nation in a fundamental and a big challenge that will ripple across the world for other democracies, and in terms of how our struggles, how our challenges, how our flashpoints play out.
Seen from outside, David, the United States looks like two countries. One is the coasts, and the other one is the center or the heartland of the nation. What is it that divides the country in such clear-cut terms, except for perhaps Illinois in the center of the country? Is there different news outlets in the center, in Nebraska or places like that, than in New York or California? What is the basics of this? Because most of them share the same, say, problems. And funnily enough, more migration, for instance, goes to the coasts or the coastal states than the center of the country, except for Texas, perhaps. What is your take? What is
Sure.
going on?
So, first of all, obviously, the region, from a news perspective, the regional element of this is less important than ever, right? It used to be that, people in the middle of the country in the 1930s read regional farm newspapers and so forth. Now everybody is getting their news either on the internet or on cable. And of course, they are migrating to like-minded kind of news sources. So I wouldn't think of this in regional terms. I would think of this much more in tribal terms, right? Because the people who were going to Fox and have now been abandoning Fox, the true believers in Trump, are moving away from Fox because they don't think it's pro-Trump enough. I know this is hard for, and they're the ones going to Newsmax and OAN and other outlets that Trump directed them to. They're a little bit leaderless right now because, having lost his Twitter, Trump doesn't really know how to communicate with them. He'll figure out a means sometime, and I'm sure there's a committee at Mar-a-Lago looking at that right now. He may even start up his own news organization or buy into one of the existing ones. as his way into this. When you look at the electoral map and you see that big red in the middle, and then, what you see on the coast, it's actually a bit of a misleading way to look at the American electorate. It's much more useful actually to go on the Times website. The Post did this. I'm sure others have done this, and look within those states, because what you see happen is that many of those states have cities that are either moderate or liberal, that are high population, right? And the big changes that took place in this year's election came when Biden was able actually to win places that Hillary Clinton had lost, because he got the cities and suburbs to turn out. That's how he won Minnesota. In the end, that's what happened in the Georgia Senate election, right? Which first went for, Biden in the presidency, and then 2 Democrats win the Senate. If you look at a map of Georgia, Georgia looks overwhelmingly red, except for Atlanta and the suburbs, which is how the victory came about. So remember that you can see a lot blotted out when you look at that big wide red, because you're covering a lot of areas that don't have much, right? Even Texas, which of course Biden lost. Take a look not only at Austin, which has been liberal forever, but look at what happened in Houston. So I would warn you away from maps quite like that. And along the way, I think what we have now seen is that the rural urban thing is not necessarily a coast versus the middle. It's a battle inside those states. And it's not surprising that you're seeing the immigrants go to the coast or go to the cities, because apart from agricultural jobs, that's where the job production is that they're likely to be able to go fill.
Right. Now we'll move to our favorite section, which is the clash section. What clashes do you foresee, Robin, overseas for most immediately for Mr. Biden?
Well, I think the challenge, obviously, at the top of the list is China and what it does. I think David's right that we'll see from North Korea the firing of a missile, which is what happened when President Trump took over too. There will be many countries, I think, that will probe, will test, see how far they can get, see what the response is, and also try to draw attention to themselves as, hey, we're important, you've got to deal with us. But I think one of the things that's so interesting about Biden taking power in 2021 is how different the world is than it was when he left office in 2017. And the barometers of power have changed in large part because of China, but also because of the tools and tactics in foreign policy or in conflict generally. That when you look at what the greatest threat or disruptive factor in the United States over the past year, it's the Russian hack that managed to penetrate, hundreds of, U.S. agencies, private institutions on 3 continents, not just in the United States. And it took the United States a long time to identify it, and it may still be mutating, adapting within our system today. David's the real expert on this subject, having written a best-selling book. But I think that when you talk about clashes, that's a kind of 20th century idea in terms of cultures and so forth. That's still there, that still looms. But I think the thing that this administration and a lot of foreign policy analysts are trying to get their hands around is how the world is changing so quickly. Courtesy of technology, not just social media, but the fact that I had a long conversation with the head of Central Command, who oversees U.S. military operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, across South Asia and the Middle East. And he said the 2 things that worry him the most are not nuclear weapons. The 2 are what he called Costco drones, the cheap drones that you can hire to either spy or drop weapons, and cyber. And this reflects how the type of clash that we're worried about is changing. And the US military, just to give you a sense of how hard it is for the US, even with all our powers to adapt, is General McKenzie said it takes 5 years to integrate the entire US military when it identifies a new threat and figures out a way to respond, and it integrates all the forces and all their systems and updates whatever tools it has. So I think Biden, the big challenge for him is not assuming that the world is going to be like a light switch. You kind of flick it on when you're back in power and the same light comes on. It's a very different light today.
Do you see then an unavoidable clash between the US and China and some during the Biden administration, or do you see it in the horizon?
I defer to David on that one.
Well, I don't think a clash with China is inevitable, but I would say that, you know, the chances are extraordinarily high and probably much higher than most Americans and most of the allies think about, not necessarily in Biden's term. My co-teacher in our Harvard class, Graham Allison, has written a book about this topic in which, you know, he makes the point that when you've got a rising power and a status quo power, you know, by his estimate, you know, 2/3 of the time, it does result in some kind of a clash.
The Peloponnesian War, no?
Right. Well, the exception to the rule, and what we have to sort of make this try to look like, is how the British dealt with the United States as a rising power in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. But of course, we had gone to war with them already a few times, right? Let me come back on the excellent point that Robin was making about thinking in different terms about conflict. We all grew up thinking about Cold War clashes and worrying about nuclear weapons and so forth and so on. And that there's all good reason to go be concerned about that for obvious reasons. But the fact of the matter is that no one wants to take the United States military on directly. Very few countries can. It's expensive, and it usually doesn't end well. And that's why cyber and other related inexpensive technologies, including the Costco drones that Robin discussed, which are mostly, I was in Costco the other day. They're selling basically DJI drones, which were all Chinese made. So there's a bigger question about where all the data is going back to when you fly it over your neighborhood and have your kids look at the pictures on your phone. But it'll be a short war because the ones I saw only have 30-minute batteries in them. But solar winds is probably a much better indication of where that kind of conflict is headed. And had we not been involved in this unbelievable, strange lie about what happened in the US election, this would have been a story that gripped every single person every single night. Because what the Russians did was on such a scale that Biden inherits a government in which he cannot trust the computer systems that he is working with. And while right now we only know about surveillance efforts, and they're fairly narrow, the way they got into the computer systems bores a hole of back doors into those systems in such a way that we may only have seen stage one of the conflict. And the actual malware insertion, the ability to bring systems down, to manipulate data, that may well be in phase 2 or 3.
Can I just add one quick point on that? And I think that David's absolutely right. I'm a child of the Cold War, and I remember people building civil defense shelters where you could hide and store all your canned goods if there was a nuclear explosion. And I think one of the things about the 21st century is that increasingly our fears are about invisible wars, and that this is something that we're not expecting huge mushroom clouds necessarily to be the sign of the dangers or the damage. And that the whole idea of what even does a clash mean? What is warfare? That our basic understandings of those words are being changed faster than we can keep up with. And I think it takes a great deal of imagination to look ahead and try to plan for what's possible. And the problem for every administration, whatever their ambitions and whatever glorious things they set out to achieve, they get stuck. The rule of, as David and I know so well, is that diplomacy often gets overtaken by events on the ground, and you end up being reactive rather than proactive. And this, again, I think is going to be a problem ever more today because change is happening so fast. When you look at the big transformative events in history, at least for the United States, you know, what happened after World War II being an example, we had a moment to take a breath and create new institutions, the United Nations and NATO, create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that we created a different world and different mechanisms and institutions to deal with it. And one of the problems today is with all of this change happening ever so much faster, we do not have that moment to take a breath and say, what the hell do we need? And what can we do about it? How can we work together? Nobody can move that quickly. And it particularly compounded by a pandemic that's isolated us all. We can't get together except virtually. I mean, Zoom is wonderful, and we've all discovered it and made life a lot easier so that we're not totally isolated. But the fact is, we need to get together and have those sessions where we discuss what is it, how can we adapt to all these changes? And I think that's what's missing, and I think that will be the challenge for the Biden administration.
On the other hand, I mean, I completely agree that the nature of conflict has changed dramatically over the last 10 or 15 years. However, I think that from the American point of view, there are only a handful of countries that can actually do harm, even in that field, to the United States. It's like, what, 5 countries? Iran, Korea, Russia, China, name another one.
Let me take you up on your challenge there. Okay. So in the world of nuclear weapons, of course, we only have 9 countries that have, right, you know, that are nuclear armed right now. Okay. In the world of cyber, which is, you know, we'll use as sort of a rough measure, though, as Robin points out, hardly the only technology one would go turn to. Certainly the big players on the adversary side for the United States would be Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. But think about it. It's taken 75 years since the explosion of a nuclear weapon to get to 9 countries. When I was working on The Perfect Weapon, my book that came out in 2018, and as we counted 35 countries, roughly, give or take, that by that time had the capacity to execute a sophisticated cyber attack, not something that is just, you know, 35. By the time we got around to working on the HBO version of the book, which came out in October, same title, The Perfect Weapon. If this is a topic that grabs anybody, I'll do the shameless ad for it, but it's on HBO. We stopped counting.
Right.
Okay. In part because it's hard to tell, but remember that nuclear weapons, you need uranium, plutonium, billions of dollars, you know, so forth. To do good cyber weapons, you need some laptops, some stolen code from the NSA, and there certainly seems to be a lot of that around. Some, teenagers and young hackers, some pizza, some Red Bull to keep you awake, and you're basically good to go. Very low cost of entry.
Right. Let me move for a second. Yeah, we're probably at the end of our webinar on the regional approach. How do you perceive, Robin, Biden's policy towards the neighbors, the only 2 neighbors that the United States has? I know that he's meeting quite shortly, I believe this week, with Prime Minister Trudeau. Is there a vision of the region, even from the security point of view, that we think is very, very important? We share the same region. We are vulnerable together, if you will. How do you see is there an approach of the Biden administration towards North America?
Well, when I was invited to do this event, I gave them the warning or the caveat, I don't know U.S.-Mexico relations. So that's
But in general, I mean, the North American region as
Yeah.
such, NAFTA region, however you want to call it.
Yeah, I think the fact that his first call is going to be Justin Trudeau, a man whom President Trump, insulted after he was hosting was it the G8, David? I've forgotten. Anyway, it was one of the big meetings, and
Yeah.
he then went on.
It was G20, yeah.
20, and he left early and to fly off to see the North Korean, and he insulted Trudeau and in a way that was totally unnecessary, puzzling. And the fact that Biden is making his first call there tells us a lot about how strongly he feels about America, all of America, North, Canada, Mexico. And so I think that there will be a very different tone. What he will do specifically, I mean, I think it was fascinating to watch, I think it was MSNBC yesterday, showing the bulldozers or the machines along the wall that were ordered to stop. And the guys on the ground were waiting for orders from higher ups about whether they were supposed to keep working or not. And I think, the idea of walling off parts of North America are out the window. So that's the broad principle. What it'll do specifically, I don't know. But I just want to put a plug in for David's documentary on HBO, which is superb. I'm not a great one for documentaries in this pandemic era because they're so serious and something, but it's so well done. I learned so much, and this is something I cover. So watch it.
Yeah, I will, certainly.
Thank you, Robin. I think Robin's absolutely right. You're not going to see the gratuitous insults, the whole pay, you don't have to pay for a wall that we've stopped building. That's good news. Okay. Yeah. But remember that one of those executive orders that signed yesterday killed the Keystone 2 project, right?
Right.
And so after the great congratulations and the invitations to go visit each other and all that, there's going to be a rather nasty part to the US-Canada conversation, I suspect.
Oh, most definitely. And on the other hand, the relationship with Mexico seems to improve just by mere executive orders of yesterday. I mean, the DACA news is very important for the Dreamers. A path for citizenship is also something that I don't know whether that's feasible. That's something that I'd like to ask you. Whether you think that in this Congress it's feasible to have 60-odd senators signing up for a path to citizenship for undocumented workers. How do you see it, David?
I actually do. You may remember that the day before 9/11, this was basically exactly the proposal that George W. Bush, but I remember being on the South Lawn of the White House. It was 2 days before.
Yeah, that's right.
And the Mexican president was visiting, and it didn't look exactly like what it is that Biden is, but it was the same general direction. The reason I think that there is a possibility here is that I think the Republican Party is going to look at the results of the past election, where, in the past 2 years, they've managed to lose the House, then the presidency, then the Senate. And they're going to begin to look, one would think, at the demographics of where that is going, exactly what they were urged to do after Obama first won, right?
Right.
And failed to do. And I think they're going to come to the conclusion that they are politically on the wrong side of that argument. And you only need to pick off, at that point, 9 senators, right?
Yes, at least 9, yeah. You mentioned, David, a few minutes ago about the staffing of President Biden, that he's going to even lower layers of policy. One appointment was Roberta Jacobson, the ambassador, who is now the czar for the border.
Yeah,
that's a figure that had not been in place since the Carter days, I believe.
No, she had a role. She had a role in the Obama administration. I think. Sure. Robin, do I have this right, or am I? I'm out of my normal territory.
No,
But
she
I
opened up
think she did,
relations
because
with
I
Cuba.
remember dealing with her during the Obama years on some issues. I just can't remember what post she was in. I think
No,
she was in a fairly senior post at State in Washington. Is that right, Robin? Does that ring a bell?
It rings a bell.
No, yes, I'm positive because she's the one that organized the opening up of relations with Cuba.
That's right. That was
She
exactly it. And that was, you've now reminded me, she did the Cuba briefings for us on it. Yeah.
And she was also ambassador to Mexico for 2 years. And then
And
she resigned.
And I think she's got a sort of separate relationship with Biden at some point or another.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was when he was in the Senate, but the two of them know each other fairly well.
But that's very interesting because we have to have a flowing border. Right now, as you know, it's shuttered. It's only is for trucks. And actually, Americans can come to Mexico, or Mexicans cannot go to the US. But that's a minor thing, if you will. The interesting part is that there's a vision for the border as a source of wealth and source of prosperity for both countries, which make it very interesting. And finally, let's devote perhaps the last few minutes to the cabinet. How do you see the cabinet? I see a melting pot there. I mean, you have all kinds of colors, breeds, whatever you want to call it. People very skillful in most of the places. But how would you grade the cabinet of Mr. Biden, Robin?
So I think the most interesting thing about his personnel choices is that they have all worked with each other before. They walked into their offices knowing the computer system, knowing how to contact each other, having formulated policy together before. Some of them were bumped up a position or two, but they, by and large, have known each other for years, if not decades. They know these issues intimately. I mean, I went to North Korea with Wendy Sherman, who's now the #2 at the State Department, 20 years ago. And Bill Burns over at the CIA is one of the most congenial, knowledgeable sources when it comes to Russia, the Middle East. He started the secret Iran negotiations. This is a team that is, first of all, very diverse, and that's a wonderful reflection, an acknowledgement of the splendid diversity of this country. You have Blacks, whites, you have Muslims, Christians, you have a gay man, a transgender woman. Yesterday, we witnessed a African Asian woman becoming the most powerful woman in American history, who was given the oath of office by a Latina Supreme Court justice. So this is, a different America. These are not all white guys. And so I am most encouraged by the fact that this team really hits the ground running. It's not just the numbers, it's the experience. And I think most of them have proven they have integrity. They may not succeed. America has made many, many mistakes and will probably make more, even under someone who with such experience, foreign policy experience as Joe Biden. But they will do it with integrity and purpose and knowledge and experience. And, there won't be that long learning curve. I mean, one of the things about Trump's cabinet was they didn't know each other. And they, these guys have been talking to each other throughout their 4 years out of power. So they have a game plan, and the game plan has already started.
It looks tremendously professional by comparison, not only in the bond among themselves, but also in their capacity and their skills and expertise, actually. And
I think, let me just throw in there, I agree completely with what Robin said. And this is a very skilled group, and they know what they're doing, and they've written a lot on these topics. It is not like what happened in the first days of the Trump administration, where they put in a Secretary of State who had, been a very successful business executive at ExxonMobil and had absolutely no idea what he was doing inside the State Department. The risk here, and it's a modest one, and I say this about people who, as Robin points out, we've known for years. Some of them I went to college with, which gives you an idea of, that was more than a couple of years ago. But the risk here is that they have been together so long that they can begin to, as we say in the biz, inhale their own fumes. In other words, they've so set their positions about what the way something should be that it might be harder for new blood to come in and challenge an existing thought. Now, on China, we're seeing that happen, okay, because events ran out beyond them. Tony Blinken made the point during his testimony that he regretted mistakes they made on Syria. So these are all things where, you know, the question is, can newcomers begin to say, maybe we need to rethink this one?
Can I just add too, I think that some of them were among the insurgents during the Obama years when they would challenge. Bill Burns, who's now at the CIA, was the one who warned against the Iraq War. He and Ryan Crocker, a very prominent American diplomat, wrote a warning called The Perfect Storm. And so I think that there are those who, not just because they're experienced, but they're willing to challenge the system and be voices that say, wait a minute. So I think there's a little bit more of that as well that will work in their favor. Although, you know, God bless them and Godspeed, what a world they have to deal with.
Yeah. On one particular issue on DHS, there is a Mr. Mayorkas that has been appointed. Do you have any take on him? Because I ask this because DHS for Mexico is very, very important as well, as you well know.
I dealt with him a little bit when he was the deputy at DHS during the Obama administration, so he knows these issues well. He is, in fact, the son of immigrants. In fact, I think he was born outside the United States and brought to LA, I think he told me, in the first few weeks of his life. So he was an immigrant, but had no memory of being an immigrant. Probably the first Jewish Cuban cabinet member that I can recall we've had. So he's an interesting mix. A couple of things to think about. I mean, obviously, I think he is of a mind with President Biden on the border issues. Remember that the border issues are fully, not quite, but almost half of what DHS does. And the rest is infrastructure and cyber protection. And given the events of the past few years, do not underestimate in your mind where that is on Biden's scale. In fact, while we were sitting here, Biden has issued some orders for some studies of some cyber attacks on the United States that are going to fall heavily, among others, on DHS. So while I know everybody in Mexico focuses very heavily, as they should, on the border issues, I think you're going to see him sort of split his time on this stuff.
They have the brief on counterterrorism, right, at DHS, don't they?
They have part of it. The Pentagon has part of it, depending on where it is. The CIA has part of it, and the FBI has part of it. And that's part of our difficulty with in these areas. Other in the border, they've got, you know, pretty much, you know, they can do it with a fairly compact group of bureaucracies. In these other arenas, it's probably too spread out.
Yeah. Okay, and I'd like to pass on the baton to Luis Gerardo to say farewell and a few thoughts, final thoughts. I, for one, want to thank you, Robin and David. It's been a true pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much. Please, Luis Gerardo.
And we still have 5 minutes before thanking you. This has been a terrific discussion, very helpful to us, and we're very privileged in Aspen Institute to have you here today. I have one question for both of you. When President Trump arrived in office, some thought that it was because all of those people that voted for him, in many situations, they were the underserved. They were those that were kept in the sidelines, those that were in the margins. And that was the reason why President Trump got there. Now, President Biden is there. He's there for because of several million votes. But if you see it percentage-wise, it's still a small percentage and still 72 million people, or around that, or around 70 million people voted for President Trump, even if he lost. And you're still saying that a good number of million are still behind him. And more than putting
A good number of tens of millions are still behind him.
Correct. So if a good number of tens of millions are still behind him, and we just take off the name Donald Trump, and we think, what are those people for, and why are they against ideas like President Biden's ideas? So the question is, or the point is, all of those people voted against the old regime because they were not voting Republican or Democrat. They were voting against the old regime. So how do you think President Biden's regime will be vis-a-vis the old regime? And then if it's going to be really different, if the President Biden's regime is really, or President Biden's government is going to take care of the underserved, of those that are kept on the sidelines, overall of those that are angry, then things could change. But otherwise, if we're just going back to the old, we save democracy, or you save democracy in the United States, democracy has been saved, the old regime is back, then what may be the reaction of all of those people that voted for President Trump because they were angry with the old regime, because they were the forgotten ones?
Robin, you want to take the first shot?
Yeah, sure. David and I both live in Washington, and I think all of us who cover anything to do with the U.S. government are wondering where those votes go. It's notable that President Biden, in his inaugural address, used not just the word unity over and over, but talked about, and has talked about throughout the campaign, trying to deal with the underserved and the minorities and people who feel that they've been neglected by our system. And I think that's why you saw very important indication in the Georgia Senate election that Democrats could turn around what was a red state where there are many minorities and underserved as part of the American South. So needless to say, I think Biden has about 6 months before we're already beginning to talk about the 2022 congressional election and where those tens of millions of votes actually end up, and will they turn around and put Republicans back in charge, what is now a very narrow edge for the Democrats in the House and an even split in the Senate. There is a lot at stake, and this could turn against Joe Biden very quickly. So he has to move quickly because of the very people you've identified.
I would agree with that. Usually you lose control of the House in the midterm election. Certainly it happened to Obama. What's interesting is Republicans gained in the House in this election, even while Trump lost. So think about that. It was already moving in that direction. Second thing, which I think is sort of implicit in your very good question, is who are the Trump voters without Trump, right? And there is a portion of the Trump voters who actually don't care about any of the policy positions we have discussed today, that, believe it or not, don't read Robin on Iran and don't read me on North Korea or cyber or something like that. All they care about is that Donald Trump declared that he was going to come in and break things and wipe out the elites who were signing these trade agreements that were eliminating jobs, across America. And they didn't want to hear about the details. They were not terribly interested in policy. And for 4 years, they got a president who never gave really a serious policy speech. He just made declarations. He didn't back it up with any evidence. And that was fine with them. And he still got 75 million votes. Okay. So 2 ways this could go. This group could suddenly become fascinated in policy in the next 4 years. I don't think that's going to happen. They could get Donald Trump a second time. He could run again. I have my doubts whether that would work given what the last few weeks look like, but memories are short in America. Or someone could step in and say, I'm the smart, well-spoken Trump, right? And that's Nikki Haley's bet. coming from an immigrant family, but, basically thinks she can inherit the Trump base, but come across as the far more articulate Trump. That's Pompeo's bet, right? Here's a man who was served in the military, so you don't have the issues you had with Trump. Went to West Point, was at Harvard Law School, was a committee chairman in Congress, was CIA director, and then Secretary of State. So it's not like this is his first rodeo when it comes to governing. Unfortunately, he gives the world's worst speeches, and he's not much of a natural politician. But you already see people looking to see if they can grab the energy of the Trump base, but moderate the tweeting side of Trump, or the tweeting side until 2 weeks ago.
Well, it's been very interesting answers. We'll have to see what follows, and I think it's a very good way to close this event that has been wonderful. We're very privileged to have had you here in this event, and hopefully we'll be able to get together again in the near future. Thank you for your generosity of being here and for participating with the Aspen Institute.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Robin. Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Don't go to the street.
Streets are nice and quiet here.
All right.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
See you soon. Thanks a million. Thanks a million. Take care.